Shana Tova. Shabbat Shalom. I keep doing that in the wrong order, but you get the idea. So, about a year ago, I embarked on a research project in Jewish education as part of my work towards a certificate in Jewish educational leadership a program I was in through Hebrew Union College. And I've decided not to complete the project or the degree because it was clear that one of the things I was going to have to give up was that in taking on this new role at Beth Jacob. But I want to tell you a little bit about the project because the gleanings from that work actually speak to the possibilities for meaningful learning and growth really in any Jewish communal organization. The purpose of the project was to see how engaging teachers in Jewish text study, specifically with texts that deal with teaching and learning, might impact the experience of teaching in a Jewish school. In order to ground my research in the scholarly field, I read about similar studies conducted by my teacher, Ellie Holzer, as well as Arik Kent. And even more fascinating was encountering an article by an old friend and chavruta of mine, a study partner of mine from my days at the conservative yeshiva, Josh Layden, who, by the way, has a great new Jewish parenting podcast. It's called Perfect Parents. Anyway, my friend Josh's research was particularly interesting to me because he looked at the impact of text study among the staff at a Jewish social service organization, which employed a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish staff with a variety of educational backgrounds, including some who had advanced degrees in psychology and business. Few of them had ever really studied Jewish texts at all in a serious way, let alone in a professional context. And what he found in his research really resonated with what I was starting to discover as well as I conducted my own set of study sessions and interviews with Jewish educators. Chavruta learning, studying with a learning partner, is powerful. It is transformational. It can shift power dynamics, it can deepen relationships, and it can foster a sense of community. I think the non-Jewish people who participated in these study sessions were maybe the most surprised by the impact that it had on them. They said that engaging in Talmud study opened their eyes to the multivocality of Jewish texts, and that they actually felt on more equal footing with their Jewish colleagues because there's an equalizing element to analyzing a text together. And they could disagree, even without a lot of background knowledge, using evidence from what was on the page in front of them. I first understood the power of text study when I was working as a Jewish educator at our Reform synagogue, just a couple of years after I graduated from college. The religious school director at that synagogue left after my first year I was the vice principal. It wasn't because of me. So I found myself, I was way too young, I was way too inexperienced to be running a religious school of 500 students, but that's the position I found myself in. And I knew that right away after that year, I needed to go back to school. At the same time, I had met some friends who studied Jewish texts weekly in small groups. Some of those people are members of this shul. I joined two of these weekly study groups, one in which we read the Parsha line by line with Rashi's commentary, and another where we slowly made our way through a tractate of Talmud. Honestly, I could barely keep up with the Rashi group, and the Talmud was definitely way over my head. But I really loved it. And that was the other thing I kept hearing from my research participants. They kept saying, well, I just really love studying Jewish texts. It's so much fun. So why am I telling this to all of you on Rosh Hashanah? I promise that it's not just a plug for Rabbi Justin's Monday night Talmud class. But since it came up, you might want to consider attending Rabbi Justin's Monday night Talmud class. It's starting October 16th. In truth, the reason that I'm bringing up text study has less to do with Jewish text itself than with a modality of communication that I believe is very, very possibly healing and needed in our world, and probably wouldn't be a bad thing for our little corner of the world at Beth Jacob in Mendota Heights. In Ellie Holzer's work on Chavruta learning and in Orit Kent's work in Pedagogy of Partnership, there are some protocols for the conversations that you can use when analyzing the text. One of these protocols involves a form of active listening, and another involves a process of both supporting and challenging your study partner. The supporting and challenging protocol rests on the idea that the goal of learning in partnership is learning. Might seem obvious, but it's important, and I'll tell you why. So I think a lot of people go into the Chavruta relationship thinking, well, maybe I will foster a serious relationship, I'll get a better sense of Jewish texts, and it certainly will involve active learning and speaking respectfully, but ultimately, if each person sees him or herself as responsible for the other person's learning, that can really make learning happen. So in our regular conversations, we have styles of talking to each other that are comfortable for us because they're what we're used to. And sometimes our egos might get involved a little bit, and our primary concern might be being heard and being understood. And that's not a bad thing, but in Chavruta, the goal is to hear and to understand in order to properly support and or challenge your partner, in order to facilitate their learning. Like any relationship, this works best if both people have the same understanding of this goal. But even if one loses sight of it, the other can help bring it back. In order to engage in supporting and challenging, you first have to engage in active listening. But active listening is not sufficient for text study, at least not Jewish text study. One of the things our rabbinic sages really understood, even though I doubt they would ever have used this language, was the importance of a growth mindset in learning. Dr. Carol Dweck's concept of a growth mindset is a zone in which learning can happen. It involves curiosity, risk-taking, and viewing failures as learning opportunities. It involves enjoying being challenged and believing that you can always learn something new. Now, no one is born with a growth mindset. It's something that has to be cultivated. Because the idea of the growth mindset is that all of our skills and talents are developed over time, that we all have the potential to grow, to change, and to become better versions of ourselves. That's the essence of tshuva, what we call in English repentance. That is the core underpinning of what the high holidays are all about, the idea that humans continually grow and change. This doesn't mean that our younger versions of ourselves are bad, necessarily, but it means we can, if we choose to, learn from our experiences, particularly from our mistakes. It might seem obvious, but our ancestors knew that all of us get stuck sometimes. We can't be in a growth mindset all the time. It's elusive. And so each year, we have a whole season of holidays to remind us. We humans are here on this planet to learn, to become better versions of ourselves, and to see our neighbors, our friends, and our family members, that might be the hardest, as also growing, learning, becoming better versions of themselves. I want to investigate together today the learning partner relationship, not for its own sake and not to convince you to study more Jewish texts, but because I believe the Chavruta relationship can be a model for all of our relationships, and most importantly, because I believe that it is a powerful model for how we can interact with each other in this community. I want to start with the most difficult interactions, because it's easy to say, we should all speak to each other respectfully, honor each other's boundaries, and listen to different perspectives. And that's all true. We should do those things. But what happens when we bump up against each other? So I want to start with an Agadah, a story that is found in the Talmud, of course. The last few pages of Tractate Yoma, which is the tractate focused on Yom Kippur primarily, deal with forgiveness. Both forgiveness that can happen bein adam lechavero, between two people, and bein adam lemakom, the forgiveness that we seek from a higher place. The Talmud suggests that forgiveness from God is much easier to receive than forgiveness from another person. All you have to do to receive God's forgiveness is ask for it. Once. Then God forgives you immediately. Reish Lakish even says that God will view an intentional act as unintentional the minute a person expresses their contrition. Regarding another person, however, who knows if they'll forgive you? You can ask them up to 3 times, but then the person might still choose not to forgive. And the Talmud debates. Is it that you must ask the person 3 times, and then if they don't forgive you, you've done everything you can and your slate is clean? Or is it that you can only ask them 3 times, and anything beyond that is considered harassment? If it's only 3 times, you better make it a good apology. The story I want to share hinges on the presumption that you're only allowed to ask 3 times. Here's the scene. Rav was reciting the Torah portion before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Chia, Rav's uncle and teacher, came in, whereupon Rav returned to the beginning of the portion and began to recite it again. Afterward, Bar Kapara came in. Rav returned to the beginning of the portion out of respect for Bar Kapara. Then, Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, came in, and he returned to the beginning of the portion. Then, Rabbi Hanina Bar Chama came in. Rav said to himself, "Oy, shall I go back and read it again so many times?" He did not return, but he continued from where he left off. Rabbi Hanina was very offended because Rav showed that he was less important than the others. Rav went before Rabbi Hanina on Yom Kippur Eve every year for 13 years to appease him. But he would not be appeased. The Gemara asks, how could Rav act in this way? Didn't Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina say, anyone who requests forgiveness from another should not ask more than 3 times? And the Gemara says, well, Rav's different. He was very pious and he forced himself to act beyond the letter of the law. So here we have a situation that can translate to many interactions that might take place today in our own families, in our own community. Someone comes in late. Now the Talmud doesn't comment on Rabbi Hanina's tardiness, but anyone who's ever taught a class knows that a student walking in late is kind of disruptive. And without knowing the reason, teachers probably might consider it rude. But Hanina doesn't apologize for being late. Instead, he's offended that the teacher didn't go back and start the class over. It's a bit chutzpahdik. Still, Rav spends the next 13 years apologizing for this. It's hard to know what the content of his apology was, whether or not it was sincere, or if he just really didn't like the idea of not being forgiven, so he just kept asking. And I think the Gemara is pretty generous towards Rav, calling him pious, and later the narrator explains that Hanina only refused to give him in order to protect his own position as head of yeshiva. So the Gemara clearly sees Rav as the better person in this scenario. But oof, these characters are complicated, to say the least. The Gemara gives us the full view of complicated interactions, complicated relationships. We see the egos, we see the hurt feelings, we see the rabbis struggling to stay within a growth mindset. And there's an even more famous story, which I have shared many times from this bima, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm not going to read it at all, but if you want to look it up later, it's the story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. They were great chavruta partners for years and years. They both really helped each other learn and grow, but they have a tragic ending to their relationship. At some point, their egos, primarily Rabbi Yochanan's ego, ruins the relationship, and instead of helping his partner learn, he insults him. And ultimately, they both die unwilling to apologize and unwilling to forgive. It's a very sad story. These stories show just how hard it is to navigate relationships once they move beyond the superficial. Whether with family, friends, or in community, differences of opinion, different needs, and let's face it, egos can become barriers rather than bridges. As our community seeks to grow into its next phase, what some people seem to be calling Bet Jacob 2.0, I can think of almost nothing as important to our success as a growth mindset. I wrote in the Seed edition that my goal is for us to work together to create a deeply connected community in which our primary mission is to live out our understanding of Torah in the world. In order to do that, we are going to have to view each other as partners in that project. We will have to view differing opinions as opportunities for learning, even if ultimately we still stand where we stand. We are going to have to support and challenge each other, listen for the sake of understanding, take risks, view failures as learning opportunities, and see ourselves as responsible for each other's growth and for the growth of the community. That is how we will grow the shul community rather than tear it apart. I guess what I'm asking you all today is, will you be my chavruta?
Yes. Yes.
Really, can we all be chavruta? As we move forward together into 5784 and beyond, let's be learning partners who care deeply about each other, who believe that as a community we can become a better version of ourselves, and who help each other do just that. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be so. Shana Tova.